As we begin to study Knox, it is essential to make a short note about the studies and writings concerning Knox over the years. Being at the center of one of the most significant schisms in history, some people glorify Knox as the founder of modern government and theological structures. Others see him as a sexist who sought to tear down Christianity and input himself in the middle. The truth about Knox lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. And no matter what picture you have of him right now, hopefully, by the end of this video, you will have a more rounded version of Knox. Knox's story starts around 1515 near Haddington in East Lothian. His family invested heavily in his education in hopes that he would help them move up in the world. Similar to many other places in the world at this time, higher education meant going into the priesthood. Although he was interested in the studies of the church, the real reason he was studying was that the positions available within the Catholic Church were the same as holding governmental positions at this point. He got the equivalent of a master's degree, and although he never technically paid for his final degree, he graduated, and the next thing we know is that he became a notary and a tutor in 1540. Over the next 3 years, he worked as a notary in St. Andrews. In 1543, he met with George Wishart, a traveling evangelist who had fled Scotland previously because of his Reformation beliefs. Knox agreed to be Wishart's bodyguard as he traveled, carrying with him a sword, which he is often pictured with. There are stories about the travels that went on, and although they can't always be historically accounted for, in this time, traveling with Wishart was when he was most likely converted fully as a Christian. Wishart was renowned by many as not only a great preacher, but also a genuinely caring guy. Knox's foundational beliefs of Reformation were placed in words spoken by Wishart. Still, if the seeds were planted by Wishart, they began to grow when Cardinal Beaton, the Archbishop of St. Andrews, entered the scene. In the background of the life of Knox, there is a massive political movement between England, Scotland, and France. And although it will come into play in this biography, for the most part, we will be glossing over most of what happened. If you want a breakdown of the political situation happening through the life of Knox, follow the link below to Bruce Gore's video, which weaves both narratives together. But for the sake of this video, all you need to know is that Scotland's leadership was against the Reformation and very much wanted to keep the Catholic tradition in order. Catching back up with Cardinal Beaton, because Wishart was pro-Reformation, they seized him and charged him with heresy. On March 1st, 1546, Wishart was burned at the stake while Beaton watched on. This outraged many people. Not only was Wishart not doing anything worthy of death, Beaton himself, although a cardinal, was also openly having affairs and was using the position for political gain. For many, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. A couple months later, while Knox had returned to his tutoring, a group of 5 men started planning on getting back at Beaton for what he had done. On May 29, 1546, 5 men snuck into the castle of St. Andrews and killed Beaton in his sleep. After the death of Beaton, the 5 who committed the murder, their close family, and some other sympathizers took refuge in the compound. After about a week, the leaders reached out to Knox and asked him to be their lead preacher. The payback against Beaton was neither condemned nor encouraged by Knox at the time. But once he took the position, his view on the situation was apparent. Although initially hesitant to take the job, whether out of a lack of experience or genuine unrest about the whole situation, he finally relented and officially accepted the role. Although he had been schooled in classical theology and understood the Bible, his time with Wishart would be the most influential time for his preaching within St. Andrews. Knox held no punches, and his first sermon on Daniel chapter 7 laid the foundation for why he believed the Pope was the real Antichrist. This would be the form that most of his sermons would take while at St. Andrews. Knox's famous preaching style, hunched over a lectern, fist waving, fit perfectly in the camp as he rallied the people to the cause for the Reformation. Most importantly, he laid out the differing beliefs that the Reformation had, such as the rejection of the Pope, Mass, Purgatory, and pushed the importance of the Bible as the most significant level of authority. However, they would not be left alone inside St. Andrews long, as Mary had called France to deal with the problems and captured all inside St. Andrews. Knox was officially captured on June 29, 1547, and was taken as a galley slave and put to work on a French boat. He would spend 19 months growing extremely ill from the physical labor and harsh conditions. One of the few bright sides mentioned during this time was when they sailed past St. Andrews. and Knox remarked that before he died, he would once again preach at St. Andrews. Although this seemed only a dream, his life would dramatically change as, after 19 months, the English government had reached out and saved him from this place. It took over 6 months for Knox to recover, but in truth, he would face health troubles for the rest of his life. But in a crazy turn of events, Knox found himself the court preacher and access to the leaders of England. Edward VI, the king, was trying to spread the Reformation into England and thought Knox would be his best option. Things went well for them for a few years until 1553, when Edward passed away and Mary Tudor became queen. Any progress Knox and company had made over the last few years was all but stamped out when Tudor took her position and immediately sought to purge all Reformation movements. With Tudor's Catholic reign, Knox fled to Geneva in 1954. He would quickly befriend John Calvin and was amazed at how Geneva had been transformed under the leading of the Reformation movement. Although it would be nice to dive into all that happened in Geneva, for the sake of the time, we'll only be mentioning the relationship between Calvin and Knox. I had mentioned before that Knox's preaching, in the beginning, was rather rudimentary when it came to the Reformation movement, mostly based on what he had picked up from his time with Wishart. During his time in Geneva, Calvin was able to teach Knox some of the intricate and more in-depth parts of the Reformation movement that would go on to strengthen the work of Knox in the future. But Knox wasn't just interested in purely theological questions. Knox dreamed of turning Scotland into a nationwide version of Geneva. After 2 years, in 1556, he briefly returned to Scotland preaching both political and theological messages, gaining support for him and his side. But he was not able to stay long, as in 57, he returned back to Geneva. Although Knox had been making waves within Scotland, Mary of Guise still promoted a pro-Catholic leadership at the head of the government. Mary of Guise never made any specific moves to recapture or go after Knox at this time. Still, Knox was growing increasingly frustrated at the double head of leadership in Mary Tudor, Queen of England, and Mary of Guise, Queen of Scotland. It would be out of the frustration over the lack of religious change for this new movement that he would write one of his most infamous pamphlets. The pamphlet was titled, "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regime of Women." This writing has gone down in history for many different reasons. Not only for his strong words that women leadership was unnatural, but for the absolutely terrible timing of this release. I do want to clarify, although the word monstrous might draw to our minds a wild beast of the equation to something non-human, what Knox was trying to say here was that it was not natural. Knox believed that God had not designed women to be leaders, and his proof were the 3 Marys in his life that had utterly rejected this new Reformation movement and shunned all of his work. Although modern viewers either like to gloss over this very strongly written work, or hold this up to discredit all of Knox's work, I think we have to remember that this was not a fringe theory. He was repeating the sentiment of many leaders at this time. But what it is also essential to bring up is that merely months after publishing this document, Knox would make one of the most important allies in his life, who just happened to be a woman leader. On November 1558, Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England and ushered in a much more favorable leadership for the Protestant movement. Knox took this opportunity and returned to Scotland and began preaching the pro-Reformation message he had been preaching in Geneva. This, however, riled up the already shaky class system within Scotland. Although it may be oversimplifying to state it this way, since this is only an introduction, Knox tended to focus more on the lower society people. At the same time, Mary of Guise sought the support of nobles and leaders. Not only was this battle one of 2 religious sections, but it also had many overtones of political and socio-economical issues. These 2 figureheads led many different groups against each other until suddenly, on June 10, 1560, Mary of Guise passed away in her castle in Edinburgh. This seemingly squashed all conflict, and it seemed that Knox had won as a quick meeting with the Scottish Parliament seen a new confession of faith named Scots Confession written and approved all within 5 days. This confession reaffirmed the Reformation movement and most notably abolished the Pope's power in Scotland, condemned all practices not affirmed by the Reformation, and outlawed the practices of the Mass in Scotland. It is also notable that Knox was a part of putting together the first book of discipline for the Reformed Church of Scotland. that sought to set out what exactly the church was supposed to do now. But things were too good to be true for Knox, as on August 19, 1561, Mary had returned from France after the death of Francis II 6 months prior. One of the first things she did was celebrate Mass with all of her leaders. Like her mother, she held a very pro-Catholic belief while also focusing most of her time and relationships on those in the upper class. Like I said before, these overarching statements need to be taken with a grain of salt, because although a classic Reformation history book might paint Mary as evil, and a Catholic book might paint Knox as a hate-filled person, these two people simply don't fit into the title of Savior or Devil very easily. Mary made no hide of her Catholic views, but Knox preached right down the road from her, and she attempted multiple times to try and work with him to make things better instead of resulting to truly horrific measures. Likewise, Knox was a very fiery preacher. He would not back down from his beliefs that the Reformation was the only right answer to God, preaching deeply personal statements about Mary while also laying the foundations for churches to faithfully follow God for years. For 6 years, both Mary and Knox would fight to make Scotland more like what they envisioned. However, in 1567, after the failed marriage of Lord Darnley and his death, Queen Elizabeth, the long supporter of Knox against Mary, took Mary away amid rumors of treason. This left her 1-year-old son, King James VI, the king, and allowed for a pro-Reformation leadership to take control and begin moving Scotland in that direction. Knox himself preached at the coronation of James and was a symbol of the new direction that Scotland would be heading in. Since the movement had begun taking hold, he began taking a back seat as in 64 he remarried a 17-year-old bride and had 3 more children. Knox spent time preaching and traveling, finally preaching some sermons in St. Andrews as he had predicted in The Galley Slaves so many years ago. He also finally released his most extensive work titled The History of the Reformation in Scotland, a 5-volume book covering a wide range of topics. He would go on preaching until 1572, when because of his old age and poor health, he gave up his position at Edinburgh. Finally, on November 24, 1572, Knox passed away as his young wife read from Corinthians and the testimony was given, "Here lies one who never feared any flesh." Anyone who is central to new movements, especially within Christianity, goes through much scrutiny from not only those of their day, but also history. Knox found himself at the center of the Reformation movement and laid the foundation for the Presbyterian Church within Scotland. Knox's legacy has waxed and waned over the years, his passing not really noted by the leaders of his day, but with more modern access, Knox has once again come into the field of study for some. John Murray has written a book making the claim that Knox set the foundation for much of the forward-thinking and progressive educational and social welfare we take for granted today. But for many, his work in vilifying his opposition, his work against the female leaders of his day, and his single-mindedness approach to spreading the Reformation movement makes him a poor example of progressive theology. But what do you think about John Knox? I'm interested to know your views about his life, and if this video has brought anything new to light. Furthermore, I encourage you to follow some of the links in the description to learn more about Knox and the influence he has had throughout history. Thanks again for tuning in to Christian Biographies. I look forward to hearing from you in the comment section below, and I will see you again next time with another informative and accessible introduction.